Hello everyone, my name is Sarahfina, and I am joined with Bray today, and as we started releasing our horror movie reviews, we thought we'd sit down and have a chat on the history of horror. I'm going to start with 1901 Bluebeard. Of all the short films that was released that considered the first horror movies, I think Bluebeard had the best plot and was the funniest. I think the best part though is just the way he drug her down those stairs. I lost it. I started laughing.
Yeah, this very old film, since it's a very short film and this came out in 1901, instead you see the noticeable cut that turns the actress into like a doll that he has to drag all the way down the stairs, and it's so just all of a sudden happens and it catches you off guard, so you laugh at it when you see it.
It was fun. Of all those weird short films, they all were kind of weird, like X-Ray.
Pretty much just any one of those short films, because you got stuff like about weird like devils that actually don't look like devils. You have like that are just props from a Halloween store jumping around.
They're all weird. They're all strange in their own ways. Okay, so now we're gonna move into the Universal Monsters period. We're really blocking these off, but I have such a love for the Universal Monsters. I remember watching them when I was a little kid. I am a collector of Universal Monster stuff now.
You can tell there is still a very big impact that those Universal movie monsters did. They were like a sort of cinematic universe before cinematic universe was a thing. It feels like they were a pretty big setup for what horror could become.
I just loved Boris Karloff and Lon Chaney Jr. And I have the unpopular opinion that my favorite Frankenstein was Glenn Strange, because I always liked Boris Karloff without the makeup, just his normal self. That's why House of Frankenstein has been and probably will always be my favorite. And Lon Chaney Jr. as Wolfman, he's always just so miserable. He just wants to either die or be cured. Every movie is just him complaining and feeling bad. They're so classic. So then we're going to move into what the 50s became, and that was sci-fi, and if you survived a nuclear bomb being dropped on you, because it was the rise of the Cold War. Yeah. So everyone turned their focus to that kind of thing.
And over in Japan, they were obviously ramping up with Godzilla coming soon. Like Godzilla was in late 50s.
Yeah, the big creature features.
Yeah, and that is Godzilla was an allegory to that whole the aftermath of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki nuclear droppings back in 1945. So you kind of see how the actions back in World War II were still affecting America and are affecting the world as a whole. And it led to people getting fearful about communism and the Cold War.
They also turned their attention to space with like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. People started looking to space to think that the enemy was coming.
And then also you had the Thing from Another World, that adaptation at the time, which would eventually be remade by John Carpenter. But yeah, you do see some alien stuff come through a lot, and even though it's very dated stuff now, especially when you think about alien stuff, you think about possibly the Xenomorph or the Predator, more than possibly the Thing from Another World or anything, or even the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Then the 1960s gave us two huge genres: the slasher with Psycho and the zombies with Night of the Living Dead.
Yeah, and even though zombies were kind of a thing before Night of the Living Dead, but they were kind of completely different than what we would suspect a zombie to be nowadays. And also you had the I Am Legend type story, or Last Man on Earth, which was the heavy inspiration for Night of the Living Dead. But George Romero came in there and he was able to create an idea that was very original, that it was allowing people to escape from the horrors that were the Vietnam War at the time. Psycho was able to establish a big stepping stone for slashers.
The Psycho franchise is one of my favorites. I love the movie Psycho, the original. I love all the sequels, but I think Tony Perkins really made that franchise what it is, because Gus Van Sant showed us that if you put someone in that movie and it's word for word, shot for shot, it doesn't work. I think Tony Perkins brought a lot to that role, and it also gave me appreciation for the slasher genre. It's my favorite genre, and it would eventually lead me to my favorite, Jason Voorhees. There was Leatherface and Michael Myers in the 70s.
Back onto the whole thing about Psycho, to think that if Ed Gein never got caught, or he never committed the crimes he committed, that we may never have seen a slasher subgenre possibly flourish as much as it did, because it all took Ed Gein's murders to be adapted into 3 separate characters, really, and those characters in turn inspired more slasher.
It's amazing that, okay, we have Norman Bates, Leatherface,
Buffalo Bill
from Silence of the Lambs. 3 people were inspired by Ed Gein.
But yeah, back into the Now into the 70s, obviously, yeah, you have stuff like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you have Jaws, The Exorcist, Black Christmas, which heavily inspired Halloween at the time, which obviously towards the tail end of the 70s, you had Halloween.
And one thing that these earlier movies did, like Black Christmas, like George Romero's films, is a social commentary without slapping you in the face with it, like they do today.
Yeah.
Because Black Christmas dealt with abortion.
Well, and this was only a year after Roe v. Wade just happened, so that was a pretty big thing. In Night of the Living Dead, this is 1968, a year like towards the ending of the civil rights movement, and you had a black main protagonist who was the hero of the story, and
but that was never even addressed.
Yeah, and especially because George Romero has constantly said that it was never meant to be something out of it. It was always a colorless role to him, and just Dwayne Jones, he did the best out of the group.
I think my second favorite slasher is Michael Myers. I love all the Halloween movies, with the exception of Rob Zombie's movies, because I don't feel like they're Halloween movies.
Yeah, and he took Michael Myers from what his original idea of being a normal person who is being described as pure evil by Dr. Sam Loomis to this white trash person who is apparently just like bullied into becoming Michael Myers, into this murderer after it all happened. And there's a weird contrast between those two, and that whole nature versus nurture like debate between Michael. I think Michael originally being someone who is just pure evil works a lot better because
it's scarier.
Because yeah, it's this unknown why he's really doing this, other than he's just pure evil.
You can't bargain with him, you can't plead with him, he's just on a mission.
Yeah, and I'm liking that with these current, recent, like 40 years later type films with Michael. They are giving Michael back to his old ways, where he isn't going after a family member or something, or he's not white trash or anything. He is just back to being a pure evil, set on killing people, no matter what gets in his way.
He seems more vicious now. It's like being locked up for 40 years has angered him even more, and so now his kills are more vicious.
Yeah, it's like you're locking up an animal, and that animal is getting restless, and eventually once it's let out, it's going to go on that rampage.
So then we move into the 80s horror. And the 80s horror was, they threw everything at the wall to see what stuck. It was a time of just interesting films. It also continued the slashers with Freddy, Michael, Jason, but it also just created a bunch of other movies.
Yeah, because in the 80s you had, obviously, as you said, the slasher craze that really was kicking off and continued throughout all the 80s and has still gone on to this day, but has lessened as the decades went on. But
you had like little gems like Basket Case and Night of the Demons, just like little ones in, Critters, Ghoulies.
And not to mention you had horror films coming out in the 80s that were labeled as slashers but completely different. It felt like stuff like Silent Night, Deadly Night. You had Maniac Cop that came out in the late 80s.
You also had like some great werewolf movies, American Werewolf in London and The Howling.
Yeah.
They had tremendous transformations in them. There was a bit of everything for everybody in the 80s.
And like in late 80s, like 89, there was Warlock, wasn't there?
Oh yeah, I love that movie.
So you had a wide variety of just random things, and especially this is like around time Blockbuster was still a very massive thing. So a lot of people got introduced to so many horror films because of the posters of these horror films.
Yeah, on the VHS tapes, that's how I found like Sleepaway Camp, Night of the Demons. There was a few others in there, but that is how you look at the cover and you're like, oh, this looks interesting, and you try it and hey, it'd work out. Right. Or sometimes it wouldn't.
I feel like as well 80s was the last great decade in horror.
Yeah, that gives us the 1990s, which was the meta craze, and it almost kind of made you feel either dumb for liking horror or you were lesser than because you were a horror fan, and here they are pointing out all the obvious errors that horror brings.
And that open eye, it gave new depictions of horror films and stuff. You had Scream obviously being that big thing that set that up, but you also had Wes Craven doing that same attempt 2 years prior in 1994 with Wes Craven's New Nightmare, where he was testing the waters, I think, for meta. Then, obviously, towards the very end of the decade, very major event with Blair Witch Project, which was
a found footage film.
Yeah, even though there was found footage films prior to it, that film, I think,
really put it on the map.
Yeah, and especially the heavy ARG type marketing for it, something that was very revolutionary at the time in the 90s.
The rise of the internet with a mockumentary.
Yeah, in which you see some pretty good works of ARG in there. In Cloverfield, and before that movie came out, there was an ARG for it that really helped sell that movie and make you believe that you could be living in a world where these types of creatures could exist. So this found footage movie was Blair Witch Project was able to set up for stuff, but the found footage craze had to wait till about late 2000s before it got more popular because of stuff like Paranormal Activity, for example.
Yeah, so the early aughts, so the early 2000s was starting the reboot craze.
With Platinum Dunes coming in and remaking
Texas
Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Amityville, Hitcher, Friday the 13th, and Nightmare on Elm Street. And to think now they're a part of stuff like The Purge, which is a very hit or miss franchise, and they're part of A Quiet Place, which actually has 2 good films for it. I'm shocked that they've turned themselves around after the 2000s. So they...
Yeah, you know how difficult it was to watch all my favorite slashers be remade and be remade poorly? The Nightmare on Elm Street reboot, I can't even watch. I watched once. I'm like, that's enough for me.
Yeah, that remake to Nightmare on Elm Street is a very big betrayal to that franchise. I think that it's going to be hard to always try and replace Robert Englund, and Jackie Earle Haley I think could give it his all, but the amount of CGI they had to use for some of his things are not fully going practical. The changing the origin of Freddy Krueger. That's
how I classify the Rob Zombie's Halloween as like bad reboots. They came out during that time, and I just always classify them as bad reboots.
I think with Rob Zombie's stuff, he had something going for him in his first movie, but then when he went original with Halloween 2, he went too overboard with, I would say, back onto the whole Platinum Dunes remakes, the only remake I would say that actually was pretty decent for it was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake from 2003. I'd say that and its prequel, Texas Chainsaw Massacre at the beginning, were like the last 2 great like Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies they actually had, because then they remade it again, prequeled the original film, and now they're doing like a remake true sequel situation again now this year with new Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And it seems like they can't get that series right for some reason.
Well, amongst all the reboots was Adam Green's Hatchet. Kind of brought you back to the good old days of the slasher.
And not to mention an actual, I think, better take on the meta craze, which was Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon, taking a more mockumentary style to a meta type thing, where in that universe, all these killers do exist. Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, Michael Myers, they all exist in this universe. So you have people like Leslie Vernon trying to make a name for themselves by doing some over-the-top stuff, and it really helped out, and it's become a cult classic. But you also have creature feature type films coming out at that time with stuff like Jeepers Creepers.
That was a good creature to create.
And you also had stuff like The Descent really helping out in that weird claustrophobic sense, but you also had these weird creatures that were very interesting to the viewer. And then also torture porn, subgenre. For some reason we have that subgenre name for it, which was popularized because of stuff like Saw and Hostel at the time. But it felt like once you got past the 80s, which that was like the Reagan era of it, and everyone was kind of like very prudish to violence and stuff and gross stuff, and that's why you had this stuff like movies titled as video nasties, because if they were too graphic they would be like blacklisted in many countries. A lot of those films have seen re-releases nowadays. Some of those films are I guess still only blacklisted films, but you had stuff like The Human Centipede now come out in the 2000s that really grossed out people.
But also in the 2000s you had the big anticipated movie of Freddy v. Jason.
Yeah, which
I didn't like, and that hurt me.
After those 2 characters, Freddy Krueger debuting in 1984 and Jason Voorhees as the killer debuting in 1981, you have these 2 characters building up, and after so many possible pitches, you land on Freddy needs people to remember him, so he uses Jason, which apparently no one's going to notice the 7-foot-tall hockey mask player walking around the streets of Springwood who he's so out of place there. And so you have him going around killing people, and everyone's thinking it's Freddy, which is bringing him back, and then they push more into that whole molester feel this time. This is like with the Robert Englund Freddy, this is, I would say, one of the times he actually gets to the point of getting a little molesty with getting a little too grabby on there.
I didn't like the way that Ronnie Yu handled the series. I don't think he was not a fan of either franchise, and it showed in that movie. And the story was stupid. They had so many scripts submitted, and I don't know why they landed on that one.
Yeah, and not to mention the recasting of Jason Voorhees from Kane Hodder to Ken Kersinger. That was a massive, big issue right there when that happened, because this movie wasn't just going to be Freddy vs. Jason, it was going to be Kane Hodder versus Robert Englund. This 2 big horror icons at the time going up against each other, but we didn't get that. Not to mention as well, even back onto the reboot thing, that even led on to foreign films getting remade and stuff like Ju-on and Ringu coming in and getting remade into The Ring and The Grudge, 2 very lackluster American franchises where if you watch The Grudge you're going to get pissed off by the time you finish the 3rd film. And then everyone didn't like this most recent one, but out of all 4 of those Grudge films in America, that 2020 Grudge is the best one so far.
So then we move into the 2010s, and there's not a lot of good stuff in there.
Yeah, because you had some pretty early possibilities with stuff like Sinister. That was a pretty interesting concept.
Hell House, LLC.
Hell House came out, late 2010s. You had VHS coming in 2012 and going up to 2013 with all the way up to Viral. Now we're going to see a new VHS film since 2014's Viral. This is going to be a big thing there.
They continued on with the Paranormal Activities.
Yeah, and it sounds like they're remaking Paranormal Activity. I believe in 2011 they threw out like Final Destination 5, which was a weird but fitting send-off to the series at the time, with it finally wrapping up and going in a seeming circle or so, where that fifth film took place right before Flight 180 blew up from the original. Yeah. But then you got stuff like The Conjuring started. That led to a sort of, it's like a cinematic universe-esque of that, but I feel like it's too generic of a horror.
I have never seen the Conjuring movies or the Annabelle movies because it's all about them Warrens, and I don't support anything that they did. I think they were shysters. They wanted money and fame, and that's what they got, but I want no part of it.
Not to mention, you also have like Hatchet was continued on into the 2010s with stuff like Hatchet 2, Hatchet 3, and Victor Crowley. Art the Clown, a new, pretty good horror character, a possible future slasher icon, was coming through with stuff like All Hallows Eve, and Terrifier 2 is coming out seemingly this year.
We also had Trick or Treat. We had Sam.
Oh, Trick or Treat from 2007. Right.
Yeah, I forgot about that though. That's like a must watch on Halloween.
Yeah, I feel like after so many years of anthology type horror, that was something like callback-esque to that of Creepshow from the past. It was able to really grip you in and interest you the whole time. And yeah, I think nowadays it's grown in such a cult status that it's a must watch. Every Halloween, everyone's gonna watch it, just like the original Halloween and some other horror films throughout the years.
Yeah, it gave us a new little character, Sam. Also, throughout all the decades since the 70s, you had Stephen King movies sprinkled in there, and they started to reboot kind of some of the Stephen King movies.
And within the 2010s, It was redone again. And at first, I was a little skeptical of it. After seeing it, I think they did some good things with it. There's some things that are not all the best, but it's a pretty good rejuvenation of it. And right now, remaking Christine, I think.
How many Carrie movies are there?
There's 3, because that's another thing. The remake of Carrie in 2013 with Chloe Grace Moretz, who at the time was in like Kick-Ass and stuff, playing a person who was standing up to bullies and stuff, and now she's playing like a social outcast who has telekinesis, who eventually loses her cool and kills everyone at prom. It was a very weird casting choice at the time.
And then they redid Pet Sematary. Yeah, that wasn't, the original one was better.
They could have saved that film if they didn't reveal the twist of it's not Gage who's going to be the killer, but it's going to be the daughter. They revealed that immediately.
Sometimes they reveal too much in trailers.
Yeah, Black Christmas 2019 came out, and that was another film that revealed all of its, like, it showed its cards to you right off of the first trailer. That was a very disappointing thing. I'm watching it, and after the first scene, I just started counting down all the problems. I think I got to 14 problems by the time I finished out that movie. And every review from that movie, I couldn't find one positive thing from it.
I watched that, and I could barely make it through.
And even, it's got Carrie Elways in there, and he's a pretty good actor, and he couldn't even save that film.
That's like with the Craft sequel.
Craft Legacy, yeah.
Yeah, and they had David Duchovny in there, but they completely ruined David Duchovny.
Yeah, they turned David Duchovny into like a weird alpha male, like misogynist for some reason in there.
So what are you looking forward to as far as horror coming during this decade?
Well, I'm hoping that we can get some more slasher things. Obviously, Michael Myers has come back with his whole stuff with Halloween Kills and Halloween Ends, coming to finish out this current timeline we're a part of. Child's Play, hopefully the original version of it, Brad Dourif and all that.
The reboot was awful in that movie.
I feel like that was such a weird betrayal to just go and just like, oh, we, in a little gray area, we can remake this film. And we're going to remake it. We're going to get the talented Mark Hamill, a guy who can do the Joker's voice and has the best Joker's voice out there, who is known for Luke Skywalker, and then we'll just film to Chucky. Something that in Robot Chicken he did before, and he did a pretty good job trying to mimic Brad Dourif's voice at the time. You have Jeepers Creepers Reborn coming out this year, apparently. I'm hoping that, I think that leaked. They said that Victor Salva isn't going to be a part of this project, so that sounds pretty interesting because it might finally allow people to start to watch the character.
Isn't a Pinhead TV show supposed to happen?
You have a Pinhead TV show by David Gordon Green, the guy doing Halloween, and David Gordon Green is also remaking The Exorcist. And they're also doing a Hulu remake for Hellraiser with a female Pinhead, which is pretty interesting.
So also coming out is Candyman, I'm concerned.
And you also have, in the future, Silent Night, Deadly Night remake coming out, which we'll see if that remains true to the original, or if they're going to do what they did with Silent Night in 2012.
Isn't there supposed to be another Bloody Valentine movie?
Yeah, I think My Bloody Valentine's getting remade right now, currently as well. Obviously, more Stephen King adaptations, a lot of remakes to his older work. Firestarter and Christine, as I said, are getting remade, which that's going to be hard to remake a John Carpenter classic with Christine.
Well, Rob Zombie thought he could do it.
And look where his career is at. His career has not rebounded, has it? And, Resident Evil. It's getting another film adaptation after the whole Paul W.S. Anderson crapathon that was the original adaptation of Resident Evil. Now we're getting an actual true adaptation to it with a lot of familiar faces that I could recognize, with I think Tom Hopper coming in to play Albert Wesker, Alvin Yohiga or whatever from Victorious is where I would remember him from mostly. He's playing I think Leon. And Robbie Amell, he's coming in to play Chris Redfield. So you got a lot of the characters from the games coming through onto this, and that's scheduled for release this year as well. Not to mention you also have Slumber Party Massacre, which is going to be a hard movie to remake with the way that Slumber Party Massacre is. That is an outlandish series of films, so I'm going to try and take that seriously or something that's not going to work too well.
I think they should remake Maniac Cop.
They are remaking Maniac Cop, and they're remaking Cujo. I think that they set out for a Reanimator remake, which is going to be impossible. But that's going to be hard to do because Castle Freak, another film that had Jeffrey Combs in it, wasn't as interesting when they remade it. The change for gender of our Castle Freak was kind of pointless in the end because it really didn't make any sense.
We definitely need to cover the Reanimators on the reviews.
Yeah.
I love those movies. So that is our horror chat. So thank you for joining us for this discussion. We will see you in the next review. Take care of yourselves.
Bye.
Bye.